As I said, welcome. I would now like to ask Alo from Samoa Coconut Cluster to open the webinar with a word of prayer. Thank you, Alo.
Thank you, Trade Commissioner. Let's just bow our heads and say a few words. Mātou te mairangi, I e pēlo swafa. Mātou lia meleni asfo. A pēo na mātou potpotu. Ngā hui o penga whanu. Ia tekundosi ni an pō. A pēo na mawa se whilo inga. Mas tuwha inga. Manatu I nei that's Pasifika. O wale leo atunu tai tasi ro wha pēo na whatasi mele nei o onga. Ia whatasi meila o whio. A pēo na musmusu ino mātou mawhauwhau. Nei a maoni a mātou mawhauwhunga lei. Wale pausia foi oni o awala fo e manuia ai atinu tai tasi o atu Pasifika ia talot le lo fio wale ne yaso ma no fofuanga a mata le manuia ia fa peon fai manuia ia talot le asia supervisor lo swafo lo pele to tasi mani fala ba au no sa tau na matu sa. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very, very much, Alo. Appreciate that. So good morning, folks, and welcome to our Path to Market webinar 2021. My name is Glynis Miller, and I head the Pacific Trade Invest New Zealand team here in Auckland. I will facilitate the webinar today and tomorrow, so do bear with me. I'd like to, at this juncture, acknowledge and thank everyone who has registered. I think our numbers this morning was well over 100. Thank you. We have a solid lineup of speakers for you, many of them leaders in their fields. You will get to hear perspectives and insights from those in the business of buying, distributing and exporting. Put together, this year's Path to Market webinar is packed with insights on what to do, more importantly, what not to do, the hows and whys, and the list goes on. At Pacific Trade Invest New Zealand, we serve all 16 member countries of the forum to connect and facilitate trade and investment interests from the Pacific Island countries with New Zealand. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, PTNI New Zealand, like most businesses around the globe, needed to be agile enough to look beyond the norm, recognizing quite quickly that the world of trade as we knew it was going to be very different. We used the opportunity to push our brand presence in New Zealand, to interface on a more personal level with importers and distributors and buyers and other agencies in New Zealand. We reckon our efforts are paying off, as evidenced by the fact that we have secured the support of MG Marketing, MPI, and other leading persons in their fields as presenters in this webinar this morning and tomorrow. Our region, ladies and gentlemen, is compounded by challenges, as we know, not least our remoteness, our small scale, our isolation from global markets, supply, and more recently, high freight costs. Be that as it may, we're seeing unbelievable diversity and commitment by SMEs across the Pacific in their quest to get product to market. Our small team at Pacific Trade Invest New Zealand is dedicated to helping find the right fit for your export. We're committed to providing tailor-made solutions for exporters across all sectors, though mainly in agriculture and fisheries, as that is where we're seeing the highest concentration of exports from the Pacific into New Zealand. You can learn more about what we do and who we are on our website, www.pacifictradeinvest.co.nz. To conclude, I'd like to acknowledge my team at Pacific Trade Invest New Zealand in Auckland. I'd like to also acknowledge the presenters. I'd also like to acknowledge the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat in Suva, Fiji, our member governments of the forum for their support, to our donor, the Government of New Zealand, through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and particularly to every one of our presenters for this webinar. I do hope you enjoy the program. Vinaka. So with those few words, you're going to have to get used to my voice over the next few hours of today. Sorry about that. But it is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker and in our first session. As we move into the main program, in the first session, you will hear from two presenters, beginning with our very own Trade Development Manager, Rohan, who will provide a general overview of New Zealand's trade with the Pacific. I think it's important to get that perspective in line before we drill down into some of the technical matters of trade. Following Rohan's presentation, we will be joined by Mr. Alo Koloneva'ai, Director of Samoa Coconut Cluster from APIA. As for the Q&A sessions, please use the Q&A function to post your questions, and we will get to them at the end of the day or as time dictates. You can use the chat function to share your general comments or insights to any of the topics covered. So on to the first session. Rohan, welcome. The floor is yours, and you have 10 minutes to conclude your presentation.
Thank you, Glynis, and all the other presenters. I work alongside Ord and feel very privileged to actually be able to be in a position to attempt to drive exports from the Pacific Islands to New Zealand. So I'm going to give a quick snapshot on the New Zealand market and the Pacific. So really, in the overview of New Zealand Pacific with trade is that with New Zealand, the Pacific Island countries, per annum exports to New Zealand equates to 94,000 tonnes, and that was pre-COVID, 2019. And that equates to 96 million in trade, in value. So the key takeout here really is that while value is increasing, volume is decreasing. So I guess in a positive way, you're earning more money for doing less. Over the previous 5 years, I'd just like to highlight the value has increased 12% and the volume has dropped 4%. Now the source of this is from Global Trade Atlas, and the reason for the drop in volume over the last 5 years is due to the decline in calcium phosphate sales from Nauru. Okay, now we're going to look at the Pacific trade as a pie of the New Zealand market. So it represents 0.22% of volume and 0.17% of value. But it's really important to remember here that there's a worldwide inflationary trend, that value is increasing and it's higher than the volume growth. Looking at this slide here, this represents a chart by country as to the size of the trade with New Zealand that it represents. And this one is by volume. And so as you can see, if you work around from 12 o'clock to the top of the clock, Fiji's got 61%, Papua New Guinea 13%, Solomon Islands 11%, Samoa at 8%, French Polynesia and Tonga at 2%, New Caledonia 1%, same with Vanuatu, Cook Islands at 1% as well. And the others, while really important, are at no percent, but that's only a rounding error. Now this slide here represents imports by country. Now don't look at the detail too much, it tracks across by year, but what I'd like you to have a look at is where the arrow points. By volume, it is down 44% from 2021 to 2020, and it's listed by country. Now this slide here, once again, forget the detail, just look at the green arrow, please. And this paints a really positive story where value is up by 24%. And on this slide here, What I've tried to do is capture all the countries by alphabetical order, what their key exports are. So I won't go right through into detail, but Cook Islands, iron and steel and apparel and pearls and precious items feature high in the ranking as value. Now with Fiji, it's fairly evident, veggies and root crops are high performers. And what's really interesting with Fiji is that wood doesn't appear as it has done in previous years. And that's because I believe possibly the certification has affected imports into New Zealand. French Polynesia is strong with iron and steel through to wood pulp. Marshall Islands on rubber. New Caledonia, ore, slag and ash, chemicals. Niue, vegetables, fruits and root crops. Papua New Guinea is quite diverse, wood through to plastics, and the plastics features there is high on value. Samoa is a strong performer with veggies and root crops, right through to electrical machinery, which is high on value. Solomon Islands, wood, malt starch inulin, fats and oils. Tongas, veggies, root crops, through to oil seeds and grains. And Vanuatu, veggies, root crops, through to coffee and tea. That's the end of my session. Thanks.